Africa's population surpassed that of Europe in the mid-1990s. They just recently surpassed the population of all of the Americas, meaning both North and South, in the early 2010s. 5 of the top 10 most populous metropolitan areas on the planet will be in Africa by 2100 if current growth rates continue, with nearly 1 in 3 people on the planet being of sub-Saharan African descent. And it's estimated that Africa could even pass up Asia to become the world's most populous continent within 6 decades, the first time in over 50,000 years. So, after my videos on both South Asian and European diaspora countries, the latter mostly focusing on lesser known and smaller territories, it's only natural that today we'll be looking at the plethora of unique countries around the world with a majority African descended population. Just like how the global European diaspora, sometimes more broadly including those from the Middle East and North Africa as well, is often just referred to under the pan-European label of white, as little distinctions are made between European descendants of different ethnicities as long as they currently share the same language, culture, and religion. And intermixing within this identity is extremely common. The global African diaspora, at least that in the Americas, are often just referred to under the pan-ethnic label of black. However, this is not a pan-African identity, but rather more of a pan-Niger-Congo identity, seeing how the vast majority of African slaves that were taken to the New World came from coastal Central and West Africa, a region inhabited by Bantus and related people groups such as the Akan, Yoruba, Igbo, Kru, Mandinka, Fulani, Wolof, and many others. Other African macro groups such as the Khoisan, Nilotes, Pygmies, and Horn Africans have remarkably different origins, appearances, cultures, languages, and genetics than the Niger-Congo group, but due to a recent common struggle against European imperialism, have been grouped together by various groups from both inside and outside of Africa. Most, but not all, of the older African diaspora communities around the world are a consequence of the slave trade, mostly to either the Middle East or to the Americas. However, this isn't always true, as there are a few regions outside of the mainland African continent that were conquered by Niger-Congo peoples, namely in the Indian Ocean. The Union of Comoros could be considered the only African diaspora country that still maintains use of their traditional African language, that being Swahili, which is also spoken natively on islands closer to the mainland, namely Zanzibar, as well as other pockets along the East African coast, becoming the lingua franca of much of this region. This island chain shares a similar history with Madagascar, lying halfway in between this massive island and the mainland of Africa, and were first inhabited roughly 1,500 years ago by the same Austronesian settlers who came upon Madagascar. Only in the Comoros, waves of subsequent migration from Bantu peoples and those from the Middle East created a uniquely African, Asian, Middle Eastern hybrid culture deeply tied to other Swahili-speaking regions of Africa. Even though they don't speak an African language, Madagascar could also be considered a consequence of the Bantu expansion, with Bantu migrants dominating the western half of the island, although virtually all people of Madagascar are mixed between the Southeast Asian and Southeast African migrants from ancient times in varying amounts. Other examples nearby would include the Mascarene Islands such as Mauritius, Réunion, and Seychelles, all of which have large populations of French Creole speakers of mixed Bantu, Malagasy, French, and to a lesser extent Indian and Chinese ancestry as well. Cape Verde and Sao Tome and Principe would also be examples of countries where the bulk of the population is now descended from mainland Africans transplanted by Europeans, now speaking a European Creole language, in this case Portuguese, both having varying levels of European ancestry as well, being much more widespread in the case of Cape Verde. Where do we draw the line, though? Just how much sub-Saharan African ancestry does one have to have in order to be considered black? And what percentage of a given country has to meet this criteria in order to be considered a black nation? In Panama, for instance, it's estimated that around 40% of the population has at least 1/4 African ancestry or higher, while the bulk of the remaining 60% also have a lesser degree of African blood. That's a higher percentage than Belize, by the way, a country which is generally considered to be the blackest country in mainland North America. In the Dominican Republic, virtually the entirety of the population with ancestors in the country since before 1900, meaning excluding more recent migrants, have some level of African ancestry, even in the white Dominican population, whether it be noticeable or not. And this leads us to the nuances when trying to point to the world's black diaspora countries, as in the Americas, African ancestry is far more widespread than many in the United States would think. Although black Americans have the highest visibility worldwide, Brazil also has an extremely large Afro-Brazilian population being concentrated in the north as opposed to the US, where they're concentrated in the south. But I've also seen it said that Brazil is the world's largest majority black nation, which is questionable to say the least, as although less than 10% of Brazil actually identifies as black, the majority of the Brazilian population has at least some African blood stretching back since colonial times, being distributed in varying rates depending on self-identified racial group as well as geographic region. But if you considered Brazil to be a black nation, since most of the population has African blood, you'd also have to consider it to be a white nation, since most of the population also has European blood, as well as an Amerindian nation, as most Brazilians also have some Native American blood as well. Now, you can see how modern American classifications of race really don't make sense when it comes to some parts of the world, and most don't realize just how mixed up some regions are, especially those in the Americas. However, the bulk of the visible African diaspora would without a doubt be centered around the Caribbean, as the climate proved most viable for the transplantation of African slaves by the European powers. And I've even done a video in the past on how many runaway slaves, known as Maroons, created some of their own nations and kingdoms outside of European control in both North and South America, eventually being absorbed by their neighbors, such as the Mosquito Kingdom being absorbed by Honduras and Nicaragua, and the Maroon nations of the Amazon being absorbed by Suriname. The Caribbean is where the first African diaspora nations actually gained independence, that of course being Haiti, which actually had high ambitions for territorial expansion by uniting all of the African descendants in the Americas, briefly taking over the entire island of Hispaniola before the independence of the Dominican Republic. But differences in language, culture, and religion, not to mention geographic disparities, largely destroyed this pan-African vision for the Americas. Cuba and Puerto Rico are both very similar in that even though the majority of their populations identify as white, the vast majority has some degree of sub-Saharan African blood, and to a lesser extent Amerindian and North African ancestry as well. But really what sticks out as the most obvious examples of African diaspora countries would be the smaller islands that have mostly gained notoriety in the United States as being great holiday destinations, such as the Bahamas, Jamaica, the Virgin Islands, Barbados, and a countless plethora of others, all with their own unique histories, cultures, and landscapes. Although most of these islands today speak English or an English-based Creole, the next most common language would be French Creole, particularly on the overseas French departments of Guadeloupe and Martinique, as well as in supposedly Anglophone countries such as St. Lucia and Dominica, as these islands have a very complicated history of swapping hands between the Spanish, French, and others before ending up in the British Commonwealth. Now, in the Lesser Antilles, the island chain, including most of the smaller islands between Puerto Rico and Trinidad, almost all of these island nations and territories have black percentages around 60 to 90%. The origin of their ancestors also greatly depends on the specific population you look at, with, for example, black Americans having a ratio of West African to Central African ancestry at a rate of over 2 to 1, being most similar to the Igbo ethnicity of southern Nigeria, while conversely in Brazil, most Afro-Brazilians can trace their genealogy to the Central African coast, mostly in the Congo and Angola, the latter of which being Portugal's largest and one of their longest-lasting colonies in Africa. Keep in mind that over the hundreds of years and countless generations, these African groups have been so thoroughly mixed with each other that previous ethnic and cultural differences no longer exist, and generally ethnic affiliation with any group back in Africa can only be established through genetic testing, although some oral tales, traditions, and customs that have been passed down in these communities can hint at their ancestral kinship. One noteworthy exception to this would be the Guyanese Maroons, mostly located in Suriname and French Guiana. Although the bulk of the Afro-Guyanese population, known as Creoles, have been completely assimilated, now speaking a European language, practicing Christianity, and having substantial European blood and heritage, the Maroons are one of the few groups in the Americas that are nearly full-blooded Africans, with the Njuka people being descended from the Akan ethnicity in modern-day Ghana, while the Saramakans derive mostly from the Fon people of Benin, also in West Africa, and the majority of the Guyanese Maroons, or Bushaneng, still practice their traditional African religions. Keep in mind, there are also some other African religions practiced in sync with Christianity in many of the other African-descended communities in the Americas, most notably the practice of voodoo in Haiti, clearly having its origins in the Vodun practice of West Africa. Judging from a purely genetic point of view, when breaking down each region or country into the segments of the population with varying degrees of African DNA, we can see that countries such as Haiti, Madagascar, Seychelles, Jamaica, or Cape Verde all have populations where the majority of people are 50% or more sub-Saharan African, genetically speaking. And as you can see, when organizing the list in an alternative fashion, you can see the differences in the demographic distribution of African genes for different regions and countries. For instance, even though Belize and Panama have very similar overall gene pools, with the average citizen of each respective country being roughly 40 to 45% European, 30 to 35% Amerindian, and 25 to 30% African, approximately, in the number of different racial groups and the distribution of African DNA among them is markedly different, being far more evenly spread among the Panamanians than among the Belizeans, where African DNA is largely concentrated in a select portion of the population. This just goes to show the complexities of ancestry and the spectrum of race that has been created in these somewhat modern states when wildly divergent populations intermixed. So as to who exactly is black, just like who exactly is white, is a complicated answer, largely depending on the phenotype and culture of the individual, and trying to pinpoint just what a black country is even more difficult. But either way, the African diaspora is an incredibly interesting topic, and one that has impacted almost every continent in one way or another. So for today's poll, let me know which region of the African diaspora you find to be the most interesting and would like to learn more about. As always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.